Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of At Home with Holmes. Thank you, Maddie, for those hand gestures. And for you, the audience, joining us here today, this evening, morning, night, wherever you are. And so, as you know, we are housekeepers. And so we have some housekeeping before we get into this episode.
If you want to know, because you all do and have been asking, the secret to our intellect and our handsome good looks, there are 3 things you have to do. 1, touch nature. 2, consume good product. 3, wear good product. And how you can do this, and in this order, you start by going to Cabin on the Coulee, cotc.ca.
Where you can touch some grass.
Touch some grass, get into some nature. This is time to rejuvenate your soul. Our family does this once a year. It is rated #1 farm stay in Canada, according to TripAdvisor. And so go to cotc.ca, and this is where you can go to these central Alberta glam sites with your family.
Yeah, it is between May to November, and people are already booking vacations, so guys, make sure to book in advance. And if you go on that website, you'll see that you have the selection between the cabin, which holds 6 guests, 3 bedrooms, and 4 beds. You also have the Coulee Yurt, which holds 5 guests, 3 bedrooms, 3 beds. And then last but not least, the Grouse House, which holds 4 guests, 1 bedroom, and 2 beds. All the photos are online, and the cabin and the Grouse House are pet-friendly. The Coulee Yurt is not. But again, go to cotc.ca to check those guys out, and then you can go to their Substack, Cabin on the Coulee Farm, to get updates on the family and the business and any updates. And if you scroll down, you'll see, oh, these 2 lovely people, or 3 lovely people. You'll see the owner of the business, Eric, interviewing me and Maddie when we were at Cornerstone. And if you hadn't noticed those beautiful garments that we are wearing,
you can buy a beautiful garment on our Buy Me a Coffee. This is step 2. You can buy us a matcha on the homepage, because that's how you be healthy. This is the second thing you need to do to get our intellect. And if on the far right, you can see shop. That's how you get the 3rd and final step, which is beautiful garments, the Alberta jerseys.
And what is it that Jordan Peterson says? He says you got to dress up like you actually care about yourself. Mm-hmm. And not only do we dress like we care about ourselves, but you and us, we all can dress like we care about our nation, which we do. I am not joking about that. I'm just having fun.
And you can buy more than one if you want to spread the love to family members. Makes good gifts. When you buy it, it'll do a little pop-up message for you to send me your size, so I know what to send you.
Yep. So again, if you want to achieve our lovely intellect and handsomeness, then check out Cabin on the Coulee Farm, buy me a coffee, aka matcha, and support us by shopping for a jersey and support Alberta that way. So thank you guys for listening to our little segment, and without further ado, we can get on with the episode.
Alrighty. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of At Home with Holmes. Today, we have a very powerful woman duo here. We have Cynthia Chung and Colonel Towner Watkins.
Our Gladio girls.
Our Gladio girls. One of the main reasons that we wanted to have them on is, 1, because they haven't gotten to, coordinate with one another in a long time, and Colonel Towner, whom we dubbed this Gladio expert, actually read on her channel Cynthia's book, The Empire in Which the Black Sun Never Set, which is, again, also about Gladio and the, Nazi stay behind, or NATO stay behind you. You could, I guess, call them Nazis.
NATO and Nazi, yep.
Yes, and so we wanted to get these ladies back together to bring more context into not just the Gladio thing for the world, but also, again, here in Alberta, because this is a pattern that I hear people omit all the time. They will dub tons of problems, and they will call it, it's because foreign countries aren't able to take care of themselves, or we're being infiltrated by this foreign entity. And they like to point out all these problems, but they never acknowledge Gladio. It's just this hidden under theme, but you can't ignore it when you realize and start learning about it, that it is everywhere. Macy, do you have anything else before we get forward with our first questions?
Are you asking it, or am I? The first question.
I guess you can do it.
Okay. So then I'll start with what we were talking about before we pressed play, which is last time we had Colonel Tanner on, we were talking a little bit about how when there are, I guess, said to be communists, ruining all sorts of different countries. And even here in Alberta, we have being told that it's the Communist Party of China. When she says she was doing her research for Gladio and looking for, I guess, these so-called communist entities, she was like, I can't find them. Where are they? Like, when I'm looking for them, they ain't there. And you can clarify that, obviously, as I go down my little question here. But then as I was sitting there, I was thinking, well, during the time, I guess, when people first used communist to reference as something bad in their brain, I'm like, was there a thing as legitimate communism that was something to be of concern with? And was it, I mean, the example I think of is during the time of, I guess, Oswald Mosley and like on the way to the Second World War. Was that, I guess, something that started as a legitimate grievance by workers and got co-opted, or was that something else entirely? And then also, when we're thinking about is there such a thing as legitimate communism, and did that get co-opted? And or Cynthia can also speak to how there might have been people that were kind of dubbed communists, right? But they actually were people more nuanced than that, fighting something a little bit more beyond just what it is that our Western brains would think of today when we think of communists.
We'll start with Towner.
We'll start with Towner, yeah.
So what I found remarkable, again, because of my military experience, I came in the 1980s, the height of, the Reagan era and, defeating the Soviet Union. Yeah. And I grew up in the 60s and 70s where we had all of the get underneath your desk, psychological warfare on all of us to basically psychologically damage us into this projection that there's this evil empire. And so, okay, I bought into all of that. I spent 30 years in the military. And so when I started doing this research, what was very remarkable, I kind of just started with the Gladio thing, but then it kind of morphed into the CIA at large and all of the different operations that they did, because of course, from post-World War II, they were lockstep with Operation Gladio and the NATO stay-behind units. They were kind of melded together. So, the first appearance of this is in 1948 when the CIA interfered in the Italian election because of the supposed communist party. But when you start going back, and now that you can do that on search engines that will automatically translate old material for you, there didn't appear to be a large-scale communist presence in Italy. They were just coming out of the Mussolini era, where they were basically enslaved to this oligarch class in a totalitarian government. And so a lot of workers were banding together to appeal to the state and to these oligarchs for better compensation, better working conditions, and things like that. And I'm like, well, isn't that what our labor unions are all about? And every time I start looking into the labor efforts in these countries, I find the CIA infiltrating the labor because they're there to work on behalf of the oligarchs. And so again, I'm like, well, crap, if that wasn't the communist thing, let me move on to Iran. Surely, because I have like six different degrees. I've done a lot of research before this specific research. Right. I have a lot of history. So I knew that it was alleged that the whole reason the CIA went and overthrew Iran in 1953 was because, oh my God, the communists. And so that particular one was the Tudeh party. And then I start doing the math and looking at the numbers and going back and doing research. And it ended up being like 4% of the entire millions of people in Iran. And supposedly they're going to overthrow the government. And I'm like, that doesn't sound right either. And so again, you start looking at what the Tudeh party actually stood for. You could say there was some communistic type mantra there, but it was really just a workers' party. And so you go to Chile, you go to Indonesia, and you go to all of these different places, and you're like, where the hell is all the communists at? And this just, the same thing with Guatemala. We went to Guatemala right after Iran, and the declassified CIA documents at the analyst level are saying, nope, we've looked under every rock down here. There's no communist. But if you go to the documents of the National Security Council and the special group that was advising Eisenhower and Dulles' comments, there's communists everywhere.
Right.
There literally was no communists there. It was United Fruit that wanted their crap back from the Guatemala government. And so I'm not saying that there's not communism. I'm not saying that there's not communists. I'm saying that we have been perpetually lied to about that threat.
Now, Cynthia, one thing that I learned from you regarding communism, and you can touch on what Towner has alluded to, because even in your book and a couple of the podcasts we've listened to, you talked about how the fight against fascism was largely the people that Towner just alluded to were calling communist. And so that was a dichotomy that people don't pay attention to. The first time you said it, I backlogged and went, wait, what? Because we're painted as those are both the bad guys. So you mean baddies were fighting baddies? What do you mean?
Yeah, I agree with what Towner Watkins went through as a summary. And yeah, the word communism, we use it as like this specific term to describe an incredibly, homogenous, generalized grouping, which is just not accurate. The fact too that there's also different groupings of communism in the form of the ideology, so to speak, the philosophy of economics and so forth. But it was largely, the people who were organizing themselves for better rights, like farmers in Guatemala, for instance. The United Fruit Company was directly tied to the CIA. A lot of CIA and former CIA or Eisenhower as well, they were put on the board of the United Fruit Company. And it was something that sort of like got started with Teddy Roosevelt, who was a very Anglophile president, who also started the secret police of the United States, working with Charles Bonaparte, to set up what would become the FBI. He was in close contact with King Edward VII, who is thought to have started MI6. I can't prove that yet, but it seems that he's connected with that kind of British intelligence that starts to come out during that time. And so this is very much connected to a kind of imperialistic viewpoint. And so oftentimes they get very simplified to imperialism versus communism. And so sometimes, people feel that they need to defend imperialism because they really don't identify with whatever they've been told is communism, which, as we're discussing here, isn't even accurate. But like during World War II, a lot of these groupings were being organized. In Italy, that was the major resistance. In Greece too, it was a really great fight that the people in Greece stood up to the Nazis. And I think they first fought the Mussolini fascists and then the Nazis, and the British actually turned on them during this war. And even then, they couldn't, defeat the Greek resistance of the people, and they had to bring in the Truman Doctrine, where the United States came in for the first time to intervene in a war that they weren't really implicated in. And they dropped napalm, or a form of that, onto the Greek people, and only then was it hollowed out, and it became kind of like a pillar of NATO that was a secret Gladio that was going to go into the Middle East. So there is like more of a fight of the people, an organic fight. What Towner Watkins brought up for Iran as well. Mossadegh was a lawyer, and he was bringing the case for the nationalization of Iran's oil to the courts, like the Hague and all of that. He was going through it with the process that we recognize as the proper way to go about it. So they just used excuses to undermine this and just, blanket call it a communist issue. The Russians were there and they were manipulating the government. Whereas, as Towner Watkins brings up, if you look into it, it had nothing to do with that. And, Iran was largely used by Churchill as the kind of part of the war machine, with the access to the oil. So it's always been the sort of, if you look at CIA too, they're all like Wall Street guys.
Yeah.
They're all from like Wall Street firms. National Socialism, which is what, brought in the Italian fascism and the German Nazism, was something created by Georges Sorel, who was directly connected to the fascist French party, Action Française.
Right.
And you have Engels as well, who is pretty much the controller of Karl Marx. And it seems that it was a real intention by the British intelligence, again, because if you look at it, British intelligence is really behind a lot of these machinations that eventually corrupts many corridors within the United States. But Engels was working as a controller of Karl Marx, who contorted a lot of the economic philosophies of the Henry C. Carey school, from the American system school of like Henry Clay and his father, Matthew Carey, and Alexander Hamilton. These were the Karl Marx was working with these groupings a little bit in the United States before he, becomes his own thing with his controller Engels. So you see that communism from that standpoint is actually not an organic process. There does seem to have been a lot of an intention to kind of corrupt certain things within it, but something that also was naturally occurring because the people were self-organizing and were efficiently resisting certain kinds of controls on the people. So it was not something that was ever this like perfect, kind of zombie construct or like a robotic construct. People were still organizing themselves independently within that process, but it was always, trying to be subverted, like we've already been mentioning. So it's pretty complicated. There's a lot of a psyop in it. Like if you just even look at the Russian Revolution, there are so many different factions within that revolution. Trotsky was one of them, who, from the work of Grover Furr, was working directly with the fascists and was connected with James Burnham, who becomes the father of neoconservatism in the United States, worked for the Psychological Bureau of the CIA for psychological warfare. So it's very complicated.
I so appreciate you bringing that up because I'm listening to, there's a lot of Alberta groups going around, and with Alberta separation, people are asking the question, well, what system should we go into? And so people are throwing around republic. I've also heard people throwing around monarch. And people have been lumping in saying, well, we just need to be as far away from the old Canada, which is communist. Canada's just communist straight up. And this is a question that I want both of your guys' opinion on. Cynthia, you're laughing, but this is a big predicament in my brain because they say, oh, Canada's just communist. And then they compare it to the Soviet Union and they compare it to China. Now with the Soviet Union, like you just said, Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin are not the same three people, but people talk about them as if they are and as if they have the same backing. But both of you have context regarding the backing of Trotsky, for example, and then Lenin, which is a little bit different than Stalin, and then even James Burnham, the father of neoconservatism, being connected with those. That would blow people's minds that I talk to on a regular basis. So is Canada just straight up communist? Is it not? Is it like the Soviet Union are Stalin, Lenin all the same, and Trotsky? And then we'll start there and then maybe go into China afterwards.
So do you want to take a stab at that first, Cynthia?
Sure. Yeah, definitely not. From what I've seen in my research, Canada is not communist at all in its background. It's always been a British colony, essentially. Our Charter of Rights, I think we kind of discovered this during COVID. Like, we don't really have like a proper Charter of Rights. We don't really have a constitution like the Americans. I think the Canadians should maybe look into this, if especially you're kind of looking towards the United States as a model that you would like to emulate. You should maybe start there first. Like, what is up with how we have our civil liberties are given to us by pretty much the crown, and they can be removed by the crown. Our prime minister can be removed by the crown. That's why we have the governor general. In Australia, which has a pretty similar system to ours, which is also another British colony, which started off with the British dumping their prisoners and the political rebels and so forth to Australia to do like hard labor as like one big concentration camp. That's how Australia started out, by the way. And why we see Australia as kind of like the first one to get like some pretty crazy situations. Again, during COVID, we saw like crazy things happening because they also don't have proper rights as a people. But you actually had a prime minister of Australia, Gough Whitlam, I think is how you say his name, who was removed by the crown because he was actually looking into the Five Eyes and found out like all of this stuff of like how, you really don't have a country at the end. It's very creepy Orwellian, kind of construct. We have a Privy Council as well, serves for life. Like, people should be looking at that kind of stuff. And for the communist thing, a very good example of how this has been a complete fabrication is the Gouzenko hoax. And we do have a film from Matt Ehret, who's my husband, for people who don't know. We do have a film on this with something titled CSIS Five Eyes and whatnot on our YouTube page that people can watch for free, that goes over a bunch of case studies of Gladio examples in Canada, and how Pierre Elliott Trudeau is also, he's tied to this kind of stuff. So it's often like portrayed, the kind of terrorist activity like FLQ that happened in Canada, it's often portrayed as communist activity. But again, as Colonel Towner Watkins mentioned, when you look into it, it was not a real communist creation. It's like how the FBI has been implicated in almost all examples of domestic terrorism that we found in the United States, where the FBI creates the scenario, gets the materials, and recruits some people who are like, very low, I'm sorry, but kind of like low intelligence, easy people to manipulate. And it's clearly something that would never have manifested in an organized way if the FBI hadn't pretty much done everything to create it. And there's examples of this in Canada too for white supremacist groups as well. Again, this, extreme kind of fascist sort of, angle, and this idea of, communist terrorism. But if you look into Gladio networks, they were almost always behind any kind of large acts of terrorism. It was Gladio. It wasn't actual communism. In Italy, they called it like the years of lead, which was 20 years. It was more than 20 years, but 20 years of really bad acts of like terrorism, where like train stations were bombed and things like this. These have now been tied to Gladio. We have like documents showcasing this kind of connection. So, for instance, Mark Carney is the prime minister to Canada. He used to work for the Bank of England. So like, he's very much tied into this whole British establishment connection. And these kinds of things, like if you again look into it, there is nothing backing oh, Mark Carney is having discussions with Xi Jinping and thus he's a communist. Like that's pretty much as rigorous as it gets. If you look at his pedigree, he is full out British. It's the same thing with James Burnham, by the way, because people are like, oh, was he really a Trotskyist? And then did he really change his mind? And then Bertrand Russell became his godhead. Bertrand Russell was always his godhead because he was trained at Balliol Oxford College. If people don't know about Carol Quigley's work on like the Anglo American establishment or something like this, he taught.
Reading it right now again.
Yeah, it's super dense. It's basically an encyclopedia. But James Burnham was always working for the British establishment. And even when he was a Trotskyist, he was having like these super expensive cocktail parties and he was friends with all of the people from Oxford. He wasn't hanging out with the Trotskyists. And they were actually getting a little bit like, hey, maybe we should be concerned about this. But he also becomes an atheist during this time. And he was after his teacher at Balliol, who was a Jesuit, got him to become an atheist, and that was sort of like his, I guess, beginning points towards Trotskyism. It was all like a facade. Yeah. So you can really trace back this kind of philosophy of the British establishment, which is the ideology behind a lot of these these camps that are in charge right now. Very clearly, just look at the background of Mark Carney. There's nothing that ties him to communism whatsoever. And just quickly on the matter of republic, we have to be careful using that term because that's another term that's very generalized. Mm-hmm. And like Venice called itself a republic.
Right.
And for people who don't know about Venice during that time, it was the most police state totalitarian system, very scary, where people were reporting on other people constantly. There were whisperers and spies everywhere, and people were constantly being killed and dumped into the canal.
Right.
So the word republic doesn't mean anything by just simply the use of the word republic. Like the Roman Republic, which is what the American Republic is modeled off of, is still the American Republic modeled itself quite differently still ultimately from the Roman Republic. And Ben Franklin is a great person for people to study maybe on forms of government and economy that you would like the basic principles to set up.
And I think that's I want to just jump on that last point because that's the point that I think most people, I think of it because of my military background in the elements of power where you have political, economic, and military. And that's kind of the way I dissect all of this, just because that's what I'm used to looking at. When we do strategic studies in the military, those are the three elements of power. And as a government, when you're looking at the political setup, and that's where I think people get off kilter with the use of the word communist or communism, because they mix the economic piece of it with the political piece, and they can be very different because you can look like a communist economy without a communist political setup. And that's the kind of, and they like to throw out all kinds of other terminology to mix, to kind of muddy the water, if you will. And so you really have to decide what type of political elements or system that you want, and then what type of economic system that you want. Because economically, we were always taught that communism is the total ownership of everything, of all means of production. There's very few entities around the world, even though the CIA liked to label them as communists, that ever look like that, ever. But they would label a government like the Congo or Chile or whatever, or Guatemala we talked about, as being communist. They weren't. Even Venezuela, we've been told more recently that they were a communist government. But the use of natural resources for your population has what most people would say socialist type of, isn't that what Alaska does? Alaska has the oil and they pay their citizens money. They actually allow the citizens to benefit from the resources that are in the ground unilaterally. And so that's why you have to be very careful about labels and the broad use of that. Way too many people throw around the name communist when there's literally nothing communistic about something, either politically or economically. I think probably the different varieties of socialist type, but you look at the Scandinavian countries, you look at basically all of Europe. When I lived in Italy, they had probably about a 60% socialist type of infrastructure there as far as economically goes. But they were not politically a socialist country. And so that's what I think. And I think that's why our education system has failed us in teaching us basic principles to be able to talk intelligently about what it is that we're seeing. And I think that was on purpose because they can lead narratives of these labeling of different entities because we're psychologically programmed to say, with this label, that means this, and that's bad. And with this label, this is this, and this is bad. But we have this republic, to Cynthia's point, we have this republic, which we don't really even have anymore because they've bastardized the entire thing. We have this republic called, because now they even call it a democracy, which it is not. And that's why I think the education of all of these different terminologies is critical, and for people to stop generically throwing these labels around because at the end of the day, they're very dangerous.
That kind of leads into my question next regarding communism, because what Cynthia said, Mark Carney's talking with China and working with China, and therefore, because China's communist, we're communist. Towner, you alluding to that political versus economic. I'm starting to think that applies largely to China because they are communist, literally a name, so in political standing. But when you look at their economics, like you said, it's supposed to be one ownership of everything. So in this example, if China was communist, they should have the government running one car manufacturing company. That should be it. One. There's no competition in a communist society. But they have 198 car manufacturing companies. They got more than we do. They got more competition than we do. So that would be an example of, okay, they're political communists in name, but their economics does not follow that. And so why wouldn't, in your guys' opinion, Canada be communist for talking with China, even though China is called communist? What doesn't connect there?
Well, again, I guess to go back to, the theme of our conversation is that the word communism is just, it's not a useful word to use at this point. So I think that, as Towner Watkins made the point, we need to talk about the mechanics or the principles behind what we're discussing in a policy, whether it be economical, political, or military, and not just blanket term it as a very easy way of saying, and thus I don't like it, or and thus I do like it, because the terms have become completely useless. And again, as Towner Watkins made the point, it's been created that way to actually, so that we can't have a constructive, fruitful conversation about specifics. So in the case of China, there really isn't a word to describe, like one word to describe what China is. It functions as a meritocracy. It has communist, characteristics. It has socialist characteristics. It has capitalist characteristics. It has Confucian characteristics. And China, I think, does not approach anything that it does from a government level, thinking, oh, Karl Marx said this, and thus we're going to do this.
Mhm.
It's not so robotic. And at this point, especially in the level of complexity of the world that we live in, it really is functioning off of principles and the philosophy of how you think. Now, I think a lot of people as well with the term philosophy, um, I think most people would identify that they don't have a philosophy. If anything, you might have an ideology or you have a religion, or you think both of them are intertwined, but everybody has a philosophy. Everyone has a philosophical outlook. Everyone has a cultural outlook, whether you're aware of it or not. And if you're not aware of it, it probably was decided for you. Because we're living in a world of constant nudging and social behaviorism.
Right.
And that did not come from the Chinese, by the way. But, and the Tavistock is another very good example of an institution that has been working very heavily in this MK Ultra that has nothing to do with the communists. It's again back to British and American intelligence. The Tavistock Institute went through an Operation Phoenix within their own history, and they made a pact to ultimately work in symbiosis with the British military. And it went from just a psychiatric clinic to working directly with the British military. So in the case of China, I think that we need to look at the actions, look at what are the things that are actually developing, and maybe listen to, I mean, we have so much access. That's I guess a bit of a tragedy in the whole thing is we have information overload right now. And it's the opposite of, back in the day, it was thought that you could control people the most easily by just keeping them illiterate and having an interpreter, often, a priest type character. It doesn't have to be in religion, but they're the interpreter of the whatever doctrine you want to have as like the book, right? And that you're going to follow. Nowadays, we have another form of illiteracy that is also connected to this information overload. And people are not taking the time to really understand or study something in a with a certain amount of rigor and depth. I would recommend maybe people watch. I forgot his name, but there's a TED Talk on China's meritocracy system. And that's probably, in my opinion, the best term to describe how China is set up as a political government sort of institution. And there has been a lot of positive developments in terms of reducing poverty and for people to really have much better access to a higher standard of living at this point. That's undeniable, whereas the West has really gone backwards. The average life expectancy of a Chinese now is higher than an American, which should really say something. And the American life expectancy has been decreasing. Or in the case too of taxes, how taxes function in China, once you pay for your apartment, you own your apartment. Whereas, in Canada, if you pay for something, it can still be removed from you at a certain point. Like, how corrupt is that? Or the amount of taxes that we pay. Actually, we were at a restaurant yesterday and there was a Florida couple that were sitting behind us, and when they got their bill, because we live in Quebec, we pay a lot of taxes because we don't really have an economy here. And we also feed a lot off of the Alberta economy on top of that. But they were surprised at how much our taxes were here. It's incredible with how much they tax our salary, and then we get taxed for every product that we're buying. There's so much that is taken out. And then on top of it, like, we don't have really ownership rights to anything. Like, people get upset over the Great Reset and they say, oh, it's a communist, agenda. And it's like, but this is something that has been set up. Like, if you look at feudalism and imperialism, this was a system under, a bad form of monarchy. And that is really, if you look historically, what we're tied to as a consistency. Why during World War II, Churchill was constantly fighting to reinstall a head monarch for all of the countries, and to undo what the Americans had done with the American Revolution became a model for many European countries. That France was a clear, follower of this, and that was totally sabotaged. This is a different subject, but the Jacobites were actually, or sorry, the Jacobins were directly connected to the British again, which I can prove in my work, which people can look at through a glass darkly. But there was a real resistance to the American Republican process that was inspiring a lot of European people to get rid of corrupt, decadent monarchies that had thrown the entire continent into terrible feudal conditions of endless wars. Like, that's where our legacy, our historical legacy, comes from. And that was what, a lot of this First World War, League of Nations kind of stuff that we saw coming up, and then World War II, this was all to undo the massive influence that the American system had as a positive thing in Europe, in Russia, in China, in Japan. We have direct connections with American economists coming to these countries and influencing their economic outlook. Friedrich List for Germany is why Germany started to become this massive powerhouse, which from what I've been researching is why the First World War and Second World War happened, where Germany was on that side. It was an excuse by the British establishment, and larger than that, right? It's like this concept of empire, that the concept of empire must continue. They went to war against the German industrial system because they saw that as a threat to them continuing to hold power over land. That's why Churchill too started to say to the Americans, hey, now that the war ended, we're going to have this Iron Curtain, and you're going to have to help us keep our colonies all around the world because of the communist threat. Thus, British colonialism must continue. That's where a lot of our concept too, it has to be imperialism or it has to be communism. But the communism, it doesn't really exist. It was used as a way for these countries to not have a voice. It was used as an excuse to say, we can't risk you making the wrong decision, so we're going to keep you as a colony.
So if I can just add to that, your original question on why would someone who talks to China be labeled a communist? Why would they? What benefit does this, what I refer to as the international syndicate, what do they get out of labeling someone a communist? So if they're controlling, to Cynthia's point, Canada is basically a colony of Britain, right? You're subjected to the crown. So if you can cast this, and I've noticed this throughout all of this, is if I can label you one or the other, and we have this dictum that has been drilled into our head that communism is over here on the far left and fascism is on the far right. If I can keep you people in the middle by affixing these labels to you, then I can control you. Everyone knows that Canada is directly tied to the UK, period. But if I can sell to the people in Canada, oh my gosh, there's this boogeyman over here, the communist guy, and he happens to have a conversation. Trump has conversations with Xi and Putin all the time. No one labels him a communist. So you have to look at the motivation of who's doing the labeling, and it's generally the media, which is an arm of the intelligence. And so there's some benefit to them to confuse the populace of, hey, whatever I do, if it's not communist, then I can get away with it. I have all of this leeway over here because I have been having this conversation with a communist, and as long as I try to position him here, then he can do anything over here he wants to. And that just proves that he's not that. And I think it's, again, a psychological manipulation of the population in order to be able to give politicians leeway to operate in a way that is not beneficial to the people, but it provides this level of buffering, if you will. And I think that's why they are so driven in America to label Trump on the far end of that, which I'm not even saying that continuum is proper, because it is not, but it is one that has been provided to us and drilled into our head. They label him a fascist, right? And there's a method behind that madness, because they can then control emotionally the people, as we just saw play out last night, in these operations that they're going to project onto the people. And I think that's the most dangerous part of this whole conversation. We should be able to sit down and talk with anybody from anywhere in the world to explore what it is their country is about. We should be able to work with any country despite their structure of politics in that. Every country is sovereign, and other than the British colonies. I believe that we, in a perfect world, should allow every sovereign nation to decide what type of political infrastructure they want and what kind of economic structure they want. And then our choice as a sovereign country ourselves is, do we engage with them or not? Not the sanctions and all that other bullshit. Just choose not to trade with them if you do not like their form of government, if you do not like their economic system and it doesn't mesh with your principles. Then operate from a set of principles and decide whether or not you want to trade with that sovereign nation. And that's the point that everybody needs to get to. We need to recognize sovereignty. We need to recognize that there is a difference between a political system and an economic system, and then make your choices as a, what I refer to, be the adult in the room and make those decisions based on your own principles of whether or not you want to trade with that particular country. The problem with the situation we've dealt with since post-World War II is they decided they didn't want to do that. They decided that they wanted to dictate the political system in countries. And when someone in a democracy elected someone they didn't want to deal with, they just took them out, whether it was overthrowing them and banishing them from the country or assassinating them.
Right, or labeling them like Lumumba because he wanted to nationalize his resources, labeling him a communist, and then, getting the people
He didn't even want to nationalize the uranium. That was not his purpose. What he wanted to do is cut Belgium out of the profit share. Right. Yeah, he was not even in that realm. All he wanted to do was to cut Belgium out of the profit. He wanted no Belgian officers in his military because of what the horrific things those people had done for decades and decades and decades of being a colony of Belgium. He wanted no Belgians in his military. They would refuse to withdraw the officers in the Congolese military. And he traveled directly to the United States and said, I will give you 100% of our uranium, but I do not want to share the profit with Belgium because I need that money to build hospitals and schools for my population, because they've been here for, the better part of 100 years, and we have no hospitals and we have no education system. They had less than 5% educated in their country, and the people that were educated in Europe, like Lumumba.
Right.
And so all he wanted was fair trade with the United States. And the United States, being a member of this club, said, no, thank you. You're not going to cut Belgium out. And if you try to do that, you'll pay the consequences, which he did with his life.
Yeah, so, oh my gosh, you guys have gone down like a bunch of deep
I
holes.
know.
Okay, so my brain's like ping, 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 and it's like, where do I go now first? So when I'm thinking of what you guys are saying, it reminds me of, there was, I think, a quote that I believe was Tony Blair, and it was him basically describing what you were talking about, Colonel, which is that countries, except for British colonies, are sovereign, or at least supposed to be, right? And so they have their own choices over how it is that they want to run their countries, right? And during, I guess, that principle, and when it was starting to get, I guess, sort of manufactured toward this deep state oligarchy where, no, we just want to dictate it ourselves, Tony came out with this statement basically saying that, well, we can't avoid interjecting into other people's countries, because if there's like a genocide happening and then there's a bunch of refugees that flood into different neighboring countries, then that instantly becomes an international threat and crisis, because it's going to make the neighboring countries upset, and we can't stand by when genocide's happening. But lo and behold, it was the British imperial system that was implementing the people to instigate that genocide in order to go in and say we have to go and solve the problem, right? Even though you created the problem, you made the, like, what? And so it reminds me of what you and Cynthia have been alluding to, which is natural organic movements of terrorism. It's like there's nothing natural or organic about that, because when even the thing with this communism topic that we're talking about is it's far more complicated, and what to me I'm seeing it is that even our terminologies and us just throwing it around is really lazy. Like, it sounds really lazy if you hear the average pleb just saying it. But also now it's like, again, is it really as organic as we're getting led to believe, right? And so it's like, no, it's not organic at all. When I'm looking at even this, what you're talking about, which is like the philosophy you're going to adopt and the principles that you're going to adopt, you have to understand, as Cynthia was saying, if you don't know which one you've adopted and that you even have adopted it, then it's more than likely been imprinted on you. And that's your job to try and figure that out. And I like that, because it reminded me of, Colonel, what you were talking about with the dualities, which is that you'll have, I guess, sort of, even on the religious aspect of things, it'll be like, here's the false debate to get you nudged somewhere else. And it's the same thing with economic principles, false debate, you get you nudged somewhere else. And so even with like the Keynesian and the Hayek debate and like what that was through you and Matt's work, Cynthia, it was making me think of even like Thomas Malthus and what you were alluding to, where there's I guess the British East India Company oligarchs that kind of came out of their own schools of thought throughout, like downstream of, or upstream technically, of what it is that we're facing today. It's like, that was anti-life, essentially. Like that's what those philosophies were. And then you'll hear today still people make the assumption that we need to, depopulate, or that, oh, there's too many of us. And Maddie and I were just having a conversation with someone the other day who's adopting it. And like, to me, I'm like, you don't even know that you're doing it. Because even our family started off thinking that human beings were a plague, because it was an adoption of something we didn't even realize we were adopting. And then afterwards, like, well, we're dumb. Because it's like, you want to kill the very brains that could solve the problem. If it even is a problem, because now that we're learning what we're learning, it's like energy is not out of supply. And even with this energy crisis that's coming down the line, it's so unfortunate, because it's not like there isn't energy there. Like, the science has shown there is energy in the ground. It's there. It's accessible. If anything, with the whole abiotic oil theory, it's just wait a couple minutes, and it'll refill again. Like, but if you had the infrastructure in place, and you might be able to keep replenishing. But now with the blowing up of everything, and it's just unfortunate, because the policies that we're seeing are very anti-life, and they come from a long line of anti-life policies. And then that derives these false narratives that we're talking about. And I think that it's very funny, because even what no one seems to be talking about is what you alluded to, Cynthia and Tanner, about the American system of economics, and about, I guess, sort of a republic, if you can keep it dynamic, of these characters, is that, well, you can talk about nothing to do with sort of like Larouchian economics or American system of economics, where it's like, oh, technology, and you can build things. And if we were facing this energy crisis and we looked back and we were like, oh, we're totally going to be okay because we know how to physically make things. But but we're so much, as you were alluding to, in a consumerist society where now it's just basically you're taxed into oblivion, and that's what equates to Quebec's I guess economy, is the fact that you basically just consume and then you get taxed and that's it, but you don't know how to make anything. You don't know how to do anything.
I think that people get into a headspace of disempowerment when the reality of the situation is that so much work goes into manipulating how we are thinking about subjects. And, we are getting in a situation where it's just splinter after splinter after splinter, which is it's kind of known as the Trotsky method, which is to, infiltrate a grouping and then you splinter the grouping, and that's one of the best ways to kind of sabotage a process. But it actually comes from the Fabian Society, which is the Bertrand Russell, George Bernard Shaw, W.H. Myers, connected William Crook, and these people who are also connected to the network that was around Darwinism, because Darwin was also, it seems, more of a creation. T.H. Huxley was more, I think, he was called Darwin's bulldog for a reason and was doing debates for Darwin. Darwin couldn't do the debates. So many of these people are actually constructs, and we have to look into why was that occurring? What is the constant theme? Because of the Fabian Society method, which is to infiltrate and splinter, or you create an oppositional group, but it's controlled opposition. And that's become a kind of well-known term, but people don't use it well because we've just become extremely paranoid in the world that we live in, because people are realizing, hey, there is a kind of game that has a duplicity in it. But if you don't know how to trace the roots of where the ideas are coming from, which the good news is that they're all old ideas. So the system is actually a lot more simple than it first appears to be, because it has all of these artificial fractals, you can say, of what it is. And so that's the first point, is that what you think is actually so important, because they need people to ultimately support the system. It's not to say that they're not going to go after groupings of people, which are on you can say, the edges. But for the most part, they need to have the majority think that whatever is going to happen needs to happen. So it really does come, if we were going to simplify what is the fight ultimately, which is a centuries-long process, it is to have something that is I guess, a better idea of what is a republic versus something that's imperial. But you can have a good king, for instance, right? And Rome started out as a kingdom where it was not a hereditary process, and they still had a form of senate that was voting in the king each time, and it actually started to become corrupt where the sons were wanting the kingship, but every single king of Rome had chosen, if anything, an adopted son twice. We had two examples of this. Otherwise, they were voted in by the Senate. It wasn't a hereditary line. So it doesn't really matter ultimately the title, but more how we're going to organize a process of society, which is going to allow for putting people first in a way that you can benefit the whole. There's always going to be, though, you can't have a perfect mob rule, like the romantic utopian idea of a mob rule. We are so far from that. And one of the reasons is because people just don't have enough time in the day to learn about all of these things. But we can just know I would say the basics of things. And the Cold War was brought forward to really justify having a war on people's civil liberties. That's why artificial terrorism was created, to give the excuse of why, even if you're in the United States where you do have a constitution and everything, you had to have your civil liberties removed. The Patriot Act was put in place after 9/11. It's still in place. in the United States. People should be asking, why is this still in place in the United States still? That's the reason why the FBI would go through the trouble of creating these forms of domestic terrorism that never would have organically occurred. It's to keep people in a fear state and confused as to what is the source of the issue, or like what Tony Blair is talking about with the refugees. And people are so afraid of the refugees or the immigrants. But these are all artificial crises that are being engineered by a grouping. And if we can understand that it really was about the sovereign nation state emerging as a process, and that the Americans actually had led that process. After World War II was over, so many of these countries were like, we fought against the fascists as well, and thus we should be allowed entry now into a sovereign nation state status. We shouldn't be considered colonies anymore. And that was the understanding of most of the world. That's why you had the Bandung Conference as well. And they were quoting the American Declaration. Vietnam, when it became a republic, quotes from the American Declaration. I don't think most Americans are aware of that. Like Ho Chi Minh has the American Declaration as part of their Declaration of Independence. It was again becoming a model for countries all around the world to seek a sovereign nation state status. And so that's not the thing that we need to be afraid of, is sovereign nation states, is actually when these countries are not powerful enough to protect themselves and dictate the terms, so that you can get these like black ops, you can get these engineered terrorist crises to occur, especially when you're doing economic warfare on top of all of it. You're doing artificial scarcity, which is what we're seeing now with the energy supply chains, to increase desperation, increase instability, but it's all to confuse people as to where it's coming from. But it has been consistently coming from a certain grouping working towards a certain goal, which is world government, or you can say League of Nations construct, which is dividing the world up to about 6 or 7 empires, but always with like the British Empire as the overall overseer of it. And what I mean by that is not territorially speaking, but more of like the philosophy of the British Empire, which has inherited things from previous empires. It's an old system of empire, older than the existence of Britain. It's an ideology that's been passed down. So this is really what we're at war with. And there's a lot of good news in the sense that there has been a lot of positive developments towards combating that sort of system. And the tragedy now is that people are getting pitted. They're identifying the wrong thing as the enemy on purpose. They want you to destroy each other. And that's why, the Cold War thing has unfortunately been one of the most successful forms of, psychological warfare on the people, where they constantly identify the wrong thing as the enemy, as they're constantly getting hit from this other side, and they just won't, they can't identify it. But I would really say people should study the Fabian Society as a very good kind of blueprint for how this sort of thing operates.
So luckily for me, Cynthia's book was like the third book. So I read Anthony Sutton's trilogy. I read the Nazi International. I read Paul Williams' book and Danielle Ganser's book, and kind of got a grasp of what Gladio was. But I knew that there was, because you could tell philosophically, all of this stuff had many things in common. And that's when I found Cynthia's book. And it took me back to the Fabian Society. And it was full of information, critical information. The wolf in sheep's clothing basically depicts everything about it, just in just that symbol. And what I found since I started with Gladio, when I went back and started kind of looking at post-World War II with the Fabian Society, I'm like, holy crap. So one of the techniques the CIA does, MI6 does it as well, is when they go into a country to assess once they made the decision that someone got elected that they didn't control, they're going to overthrow the country. They're going to destabilize it, hope that they can get the people to do it themselves. If not, they'll come in. So one of the very first steps is a survey. And I found that so fascinating. Why? Because to the Fabians' credit, what they know to do is go in and identify the fault lines in that country's population. So if you can find a minority tribe, or if you can find a minority faction in that country, obviously for us, historically, it's always been race related. Those are your fault lines. And so what you do is you start tactically attacking the fault lines. That's where the Southern Poverty Law Center and all of those comes from. So if if you have like some remnants of a fault line, you don't even have to have the current environment for it. You just have to have the hereditary knowledge that it existed. And then you can create it yourself, which is exactly what the Southern Poverty Law Center did. There's not enough racism, so let's create some. And that's exactly, and it's the same thing with what's happening globally right now. You guys have both mentioned the energy thing. Well, look, the Straits of Hormuz did not deteriorate the energy conversation to the point that we need to destabilize. So, hey, let's go blow up a bunch of refineries. Will add to that chaos. And this is the methodology that they use. And that was what was critical to me about Cynthia's book, is how well she outlined all of the different tactics and the people that were involved, which directly then overlays the Milner's group in the UK and how they administered their empire. And how they tried to craft and manipulate situations to include like the Boer Wars and those types of things, in order to manipulate internally. And then you look and you apply those same things to what has happened in the United States over the course of all of this time as well. And there's a perfect parallel to the destabilization that is all orchestrated. It is not organic. And that's the reason why they have to keep people pitted against each other, because you have people like Fred Hampton in the Rainbow Coalition in the late 1960s, that was getting all of the basically the lower income people, regardless of race, together going, hey, they really hate us and they're trying to pit us all against each other. And so what the FBI do, they go into his house and kill him. And the same thing with Martin Luther King. When anybody, the same thing with Charlie Kirk, anybody that starts talking across your allowed stovepipe, you're allowed to be in this stovepipe. But if you start talking to this group over here and this group over here, then we're going to take you out. Because they do not want all of us talking to each other ever.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I wanted to add Martin Luther King. It seems that's what put, the target on his head, is that he started to get into the Vietnam War subject.
Yes.
And he was saying, this is not a race issue anymore. The whites and the blacks are all, being put through this meat grinder. We're all in the same situation.
Yeah, you guys, what you're pointing out is something, it happened with Pakistan and India, then it happened with, North and South Korea, and it happened with even Ho Chi Minh, Vietnam. Then you get the South versus the North. You did in the Civil War, they did the same thing, the South versus the North. And then, of course, funding both sides. They did that with China, Sun Yat-sen. That's why even the Kuomintang, it started one way, then got taken over, Chiang Kai-shek. And all of these people are backed by the same international syndicate, the British, and these think tanks like the Fabian Society. So, and then those guys working with the feudalists, and that's why, looking at feudalism and imperialism, this syndicate is always more conducive to the reality about what's playing out versus the communist fascist, because they have very, very similar workings and very similar origins. It's the same people that fund both sides. And that's what we learn about the Bolshevik Revolution and then what happened in Vietnam as well.
Well, my 2 cents on that one was me and Maddie were having a conversation with two young Albertans, and he was saying Canada's becoming more and more communist, right? And he said that because he comes from, his family, I guess, came from a communist country. And so, but when I kind of gave my little slap back at him, I was like, well, even if you like go this far too this way and far too this way, it ends up looking like this, and they come to the exact same thing. And so I kind of go down to totalitarianism. Is how I would look at it then. Is like, okay, so if you go too far in either direction, it results in a lot of people dying, and it results in a lot of sort of like, it doesn't really necessarily matter if you want to call it state or, I guess, corporate control, because once those two get in bed together, it's the same thing. It's like cut off one head and one more shall take its place. It's like, that's why Colonel, you call it the international syndicate. And so then that's where I would be more leaning to go towards, of like, we just don't want to do that. Like,
well, and that's the reason why I put it on a continuum as opposed to left and right. The continuum is anarchy and total government.
Right.
That's the proper perspective. And what you want to be is just this side of anarchy. You want a very small federal government, and you want the decisions made for the population at the lowest level possible. And that's, to me, is the critical piece of that, is to put it on a continuum of the amount of government that you want to tolerate. And because when you put them on a continuum, all of the isms are way over on one end, borderlining on total government of some aspect of your life, where you don't want anarchy either. So you have to have, if you're going to have a mass amount of people in one system, you have to have some level of agreed upon government with very limited duties.
Yeah, well predefined ones. You guys have definitely, because with all this independent stuff and everybody thinking about a system, between Cynthia, you even bringing up the context about a republic, just so you know, there have been these totalitarian republics, just saying. That is very important to remember, because again, people like to marry labels. And then Towner, you saying that you should pay attention not necessarily just to the political, but to the economic system of whatever country you potentially want to trade with. Because even looking at, China, people call them communist, and so that would turn people away. But as soon as you actually look into their economics, it's doing better than most of the globe, especially here in Canada and Australia, and it's doing much better than Europe. So that's the funny thing, is that both sides are using the labels, because you get the conservatives here in Canada and they think they are doing a good job identifying the enemy by calling Mark Carney communist. They think, I'm awake, I get it, he's a communist. And yet he works, again, as Cynthia was saying, for that British imperial feudal system. With the economic system, looking at it that way, it's given me a lot of tools that I can help fellow Albertans, because me and Macy are going to be on a lot of podcasts talking to a lot of people, to think about what kind of system that Alberta would want and who we would want to deal with. And you would want to look at the economic system of like a China per se and do trade deals with them. And just because a country might call themselves a republic doesn't mean that they have a good system going for them right now. And so that's a much better lens to address system building. Because even Sun Yat-sen, he worked and looked at the American system of political economy, like you guys were alluding to with the Constitution. Ho Chi Minh quoted the Declaration of Independence. Germany with, Otto von Bismarck, same thing. It's like they were actually looking at the system, or Frederick List, as Cynthia alluded to. So, and we have movements here in Alberta which are painting the American system of political economy as a negative, and monarchy is the way we should be going. And so, again, not looking at the history with the monarch, and people like Churchill are still looked up to by certain individuals here in Alberta. So I'll have to reference to the to the interview that we did with Cynthia way back when to, again, remind people about where that played out and how that even connected to the Bolshevik Revolution. Because all of those are tied to the game of trying to put us where they want us and give us the systems that they've already been managing for all this time. And Cynthia, you pointed out the fact that there's not really a nice label for China. That's because they're not using the tools that they were given way back when. They're trying something new, which is really where Alberta should also be going, because even in China's constitution,
they have property rights.
They have property rights
in their constitution. We don't.
They copied.
Canada doesn't.
Yeah.
So that makes us worse than China in that regard, because at least they'll guarantee that your property is yours. But no, my 2 bits on that one, because it's something that I feel really I want to emphasize and drive home, is that when I'm thinking of the conversations that we're going to have to start coming up with in order to try and figure out what is Alberta going to do moving forward. Obviously we're in favor of without Canada, but even within Canada, you still can't do nothing. Like, you have to still keep trying to get better in your level of thought, and then in your ability to do something, even if it's wrong, do something. And so when we're going through this and trying to figure out, okay, so what's the system that we're looking for? Even for those who say, oh, monarchy, or those who say, oh, down with the king, down with the crown, like, no, fuck them. It's like, well, I mean, okay, yes, but at the same time, looking at, I guess, even sort of as Cynthia and Corona are both alluding to, it's like, it doesn't really matter what you call it, as in, like, you could call this, you could look at Trump and say he's the king if you wanted to, right? Sure, president, king, but it's more like, as human beings, we kind of have a propensity to, if something's wrong, and you look for, I guess, the strongest person in the room, the smartest person in the room, and you're like, hey, what do we do? You're automatically looking for a leader. You're automatically going like, I want someone to help us figure out what we do in this time of turmoil. And so it's like, you're not going to necessarily get rid of that. So it's like, okay, if you know that that's something about ourselves, then it's like, okay, how many, I guess, sort of leaders can we try and be in ourselves, first and foremost? Like, that's kind of what we're trying to encourage, is like, you can do the heavy lifting, you can learn about the Fabian Society, you can learn about Gladio glasses and put them on yourself, right? But then it's also for you to start looking at, yes, good leaders, as in, because the pattern that we have constantly is like, looking for a politician to save us. And unfortunately, not unfortunately, because systems have been designed and set up where, there's usually a figurehead. So you're looking at them going like, what are you going to do about it, right? But then if you get stronger and you're growing in your knowledge, then you'll start being the person that can be the ear in that person's, I guess, sort of decisions, right? And trying to get them surrounded with better minds and better thinkers. It's basically just trying to, I guess, give the plants the proper nutrients that they need to grow, and you're the one that has to be that. And so in order to keep the republic, if you can keep it, right? And so, or you can be the one that decides to step up in office and such. But that's where, even when we're going down like necessarily the systems, though, is we don't want to necessarily repeat the mistakes of what it is that we've been seeing, but the only way we do that is if we educate ourselves on them properly, to go like, oh, this is what the system particularly has within it that I don't like. Like, for example, when I was listening to Cynthia, when you're talking about the Privy Council and the Governor Generals, is like, when I hear people say fuck the crown, that's what I'm thinking but it doesn't mean that that's what they're thinking. I'm thinking, well, I don't like the fact that we have a Privy Council that's subservient to this entity, and then I also don't like the fact that they own a shit ton of real estate that is not theirs to own, and then we have no property rights, and then they'll just use it for their collateral for their banking, and then downstream carny, and then that's what I think of when I think fuck the crown. I'm not, but like, is that what you're thinking? And like, you have to get more solidified in even your statements of what exactly do you not like.
Well, even for example, free trade. A lot of Albertans are thinking free trade because, that's the standard competition and capitalist system. Meanwhile, when I think free trade, because of your guys' knowledge, I think of the colonialism, how the imperial British feudal system used it, for cotton, for slavery, to basically just take other people's raw resources. Like, it's thievery, because even the different economic systems, when you compare them, you have people that actually manufacture stuff, China. then you have the fire economy, finance, real estate, and insurance. And that's not a real economy. You don't produce things. And so, again, when I hear people say, if we just adopt a free trade system, we'll be good. Competition will come back. The Adam Smith invisible hand will do its thing. I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to go back so far to teach people that this is not the way to go. And it's very complicated because you have to look at all of these. You have to get past that political label. Kind of been like this theme's conversation. And I appreciate, Colonel, you actually read my mind, because I wanted to get your thoughts on what Cynthia's book influenced you on, because you're starting your journey with.
Yeah, it was absolutely amazing. And I conveyed that to her, because it literally changed the way I viewed the entire history from World War II back to the early or late 1800s. Because since then I've come across the Pilgrim Society, which basically is the bridge from the UK to the US. And it's just put me on a completely different educational journey than what I would have been on had I not found her book.
Well,
You created a monster.
No, I'm so happy that that was a useful, and I mean it's always a pleasure to hear you speak. You're also extremely knowledgeable and well informed, and I think this free trade thing is another core part of this, right? And not to say labels, but how systems really function, and for us to look into the details of it. Henry C. Carey as well, like that was what the American System School was working against, was this free trade form of economics, which was tied to this sort of City of London, Wall Street construct, which I feel is also not talked about enough in these kinds of conversations of rights of the people, because these things have been feeding off of, they've been hollowing out the real economy, and continue to do so. But Henry C. Carey was really calling out the free trade system for what it really was, which was limiting forms of trade to keep countries as raw material producers, and not to develop manufacturing capability, and again having more sovereignty in how their economic system was being played out. That's why you saw the American South was a raw producer of cotton to service the British cotton textile system, which was massive, a massive economic hub at the time. And the British were very clear that that was the form of economic system that they wanted the Americans to continue along, not this manufacturing industry. And that's what the Civil War was really about, which slavery is a consequence of that economic system, but between these two economic systems. And I wanted to make a quick note as well on labels. A lot of the groupings we're talking about right now, they tend not to like, the woke liberalism, which also is all about labels. So I think that we can maybe see the problems of overly identifying with labels. It actually restricts your imagination. It restricts your innovation, your creative process, and it puts you into an artificial box of understanding and what you identify with. So it's not you being free by identifying with a label so strictly and narrowly. It actually confines you, and you start to feel that you need to restrict yourself and narrow yourself to what you're identifying to, or you start to subscribe to things that you wouldn't have subscribed to voluntarily, because you think you have to in order to align with these other things that you think that you want. So it really is a straitjacket on people's ability to think. And so labels like the ones that we've been bringing up during this conversation, they also restrict you. In the case of Alberta, it's a pretty unique situation. So you should approach it from that, this is a situation that's going to call for a lot of problem solving, innovative problem solving. And so you should address the situation of like, what are you going to get out of this? What do you want to get? And what are the best ways to do it? And not to have labels on the kind of economic system you want, the kind of political system you want, even, because you have to first get at identifying what is the foundation. Socrates, was really good at pointing that out, that even, during the time of ancient Greece, people were throwing around words like justice and virtue.
Right.
And they didn't really have a concept of what it meant. They just know, oh, it's a positive word to use to persuade people towards a certain outcome that I want them to be nudged towards. But to truly think about, well, how would you define justice? How would you define a just system? And people are not really working towards, they're not starting at the building blocks. They're trying to start off with the finished cake product. Like, how are you going to cook the cake? No, I just want to know what is the cake going to look like, how many tiers and how many, flourishings and whatever. So people have to start at the basics of understanding, and then you can build up the kind of situation that you particularly need, because everyone is going to have a slightly different approach, because that's what economics is. It's what are your abilities, where you want to be with your abilities, what are the realistic things that you can have, because you're going to always have to trade. You're always going to have relationships with others anyway. So I think that this is a good lesson from our conversation, is that labels are really, they kind of strangle your imagination for problem solving. And imagination is absolutely key for problem solving and getting out of this situation we find ourselves in with engineered artificial crises. It's a pretty serious situation that's going to call for a lot of creativity.
That's exactly why they use labels. It is a psychological operation to keep you in a box so that you cannot solve the problems collectively, because they don't want you to.
Cynthia earlier alluded to that social engineering, and then Towner again alluding to the fact that they do this on purpose to manipulate society and put us in those mental barriers and these boxes. And one of the things that I was reading a book that was recommended to me by Buck Sexton, who is a former CIA analyst, and the whole book is on, manufactured delusions. And again, he blames the origins of social engineering and mind control on the Soviets and on China. He said that's where it came from. Not again, I like how you're shaking your head, because it doesn't account for, the British Society for Psychical Research or the Tavistock Institute. And I know we're at an hour and a half, but that's one thing that if you guys want to touch on it, I would appreciate that, because that is something that I'm going to have a hard time. Again, something that to go at the communists, there's the communists that manufactured social engineering and bioengineering, the Pavlov's dogs. And do you, Towner, since you're shaking your head, do you want to start?
So that's the whole point. Has every society not had nefarious people in them?
Right. Oh, fuck. Amen.
And this is fundamental to this entire conversation. Why can't someone just say, and looking at our past, all of it's been declassified. The CIA, Artichoke, MK Ultra, all of those programs, looking back on the biological warfare, Unit 731 that the Japanese put in China and used Chinese to experiment on, not the other way around. So if you go back and you actually know history, the regurgitating of these talking points that it's always that guy over there, just like talking about election interference. It's everybody in the world except for the CIA.
Right?
From 1948 forward, the primary two elements of election interference around the world is MI6 and the CIA, period. Hands down. But every single narrative that comes out Oh, China interfered in our election. Oh, Venezuela was controlling our electronic machines. That's all bullshit. There's not a single machine in the United States that the CIA doesn't have a backdoor to. None of them. Banking, everything. It does not. As a matter of fact, I have discovered that if you create a patent for encryption that they can't create a backdoor for, they will classify it and you will never manufacture it. It will never, ever see the light of day. So anybody today that is still saying things like that needs to be dismissed out of hand because they're either ignorant or they are blatantly lying to you.
A former CIA analyst.
There is no such thing as a former CIA. They do not exist. They're either dead or they've tried to kill them. If you're a CIA and you are no longer employed in the CIA, if you are not dead or they've at least tried to kill you once, you are not a former CIA officer.
Cynthia, want to follow that up?
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything that Towner Watkins just said. Yeah, and in terms of the, I guess, psychological warfare stuff, you know, even some of these entities are using labels that they're not really those labels, like the Fabian Society and them like identifying as socialist or communist or anarchist even within amongst themselves and constantly changing labels. Like Bertrand Russell changed hats so many times as well. And people who are very literal, they get super confused thinking like, well, he just identified as this, that's what he is, not thinking, hey, maybe there's something more to the game. But the Tavistock Institute has created something that you can say is uniquely Tavistock. Even the whole Freud, Carl Jung stuff, psychoanalysis has also been hugely influential. Carl Jung, in particular, he worked with the OSS Alan Dulles branch in Europe. He's directly tied to it. And was advising Alan Dulles, who would create the MK Ultra branch in the CIA, which we're told then stopped existing after like the Church Committee hearings, but clearly it continued on. And it seems that a lot of cult operations were a continuation off of these MK Ultra type experiments they were doing on people. And they even adopted it in terms of economic warfare, where Naomi Klein did a good book, Shock Doctrine, going over the connection between MK Ultra and economic warfare that was being launched. So if you just look at all of the details of these things, it's clear that the West has pretty much put the bulk of practice in this kind of behaviorism and form of psychological warfare. You look at Edward Lansdale too for the Saigon mission in Vietnam, and this was hugely a psychological operation. Operation Phoenix as well was trying to attempt to, just like how MK Ultra was trying to use electroshock and LSD to wipe the mind, as a blank slate. That was their dream, was to create a blank slate and then to put whatever they wanted into that. Operation Phoenix in Vietnam, run by the CIA and U.S. Special Forces, was a way to try to do that on a societal level of the people. They were trying to traumatize them to a point where you can get a blank slate and then try to create something wholly new onto that. So there's just so many examples of them using this form of psychological warfare on the people, and what Towner Watkins had mentioned earlier on as well in terms of finding the fault lines. Orwell was working as a Burma policeman. His experiences, what he describes in 1984, where he seems to be both the characters O'Brien and Winston, where he's the torturer and the tortured, but they were already starting electroshock therapy as British policemen in Burma and think it was Maui or something like that, which was the blueprint for Operation Phoenix. It's like literally recognized. It's officially recognized as the blueprint, what the British officers were doing first, in terms of these forms of creepy psychological warfare machinations. Edward Lansdale even, created, there was like this legend myth about a certain kind of vampire.
Oh, and
And he started to mimic, like that there was a vampire by, draining the blood and having these 2 puncture points on bodies and stuff, like really crazy stuff. UFO stuff as well. Carl Jung seems to be directly tied with this idea of like UFO type psyops on people for psychological warfare, which people should watch our series on the Canadian Patriot, The Hidden Hand Behind UFOs, for more on that. But there's just so much to back up what the West has constructed as their own thing, that to just blame this on the Soviets at this point, yes, Pavlov did do those experiments, and those were very useful experiments, but to just say that thus it's all the Russians because of Pavlov's experiments on dogs and finding out 4 different nervous systems, it doesn't quite cut it for me.
No, totally. And because you alluded earlier to Darwin and Thomas Huxley as his basically his handler to promote Darwinism, and Thomas Huxley, the whole Huxley family, and you could argue same with H.G. Wells, all eugenics promoters, hence being a part of UNESCO, this British Eugenics Society, and that's that's usually considered fascism, and yet they claim that, and Thomas Huxley and Darwinism, a co-creator of Darwinism, was the leader of the British Society for Psychical Research, Alfred Russel Wallace, and yet they won't associate. That's not communism. That's British feudal, or even some people, because of the eugenics connection and all of the experiments, they could argue fascism. That has nothing to do with China or Russia and their supposed communism. But he, Buck Sexton must have forgotten to mention that part. He must not know that history.
So I also want to add to Cynthia's comment about Ed Lansdale, and that was one of the fascinating things, because originally it seemed like the OSS and the eventual CIA was very focused on lawyers and bankers, right? Because they're the Praetorian guards for these oligarchs. But to my fascination, I did not realize the large role that the PR people, the people that did marketing, played in all of this. And that is the psychological operation piece. That's where Ed Lansdale, that's what his business was before he entered into the OSS/CIA, is he was a master strategist. And what do you have to know in order to be a good marketer? Human behavior. You are trying to predict and manipulate human behavior. And so they are the perfect people to carry out psyops in intelligence. Is you are basically a PR person. And that's why you find so many of these PR firms with hidden intelligence capability, because they collect the data on humans and they pass it off to intelligence. I mean, that's what Sears, the guy that created Sears and Roebuck, he had a file that, like, ladies in this whole office that used to do newspaper clippings of everybody. They had personnel files on everybody. They were basically a little mini intelligence bureau at the time. And so, to her point about that was just a fascinating thing. Again, nothing I learned in any of my military education. Was fairly extensive, that Lansdale in the Philippines had researched the people and their philosophical and kind of mystic belief system, that vampires was like the one thing that scared the hell out of all of them. And so they would just kidnap the last guy in a movement, kill him, and poke holes in his stomach and hang him upside down. And then somebody would find him And they were like, oh my God, he was attacked by a vampire. And they psychologically traumatized these people in that they didn't want to march in formation anymore. And it just began the structural breakdown of the nationalists in the Philippines that didn't want to be ran as an American colony. And that just, again, it repeats itself over and over again.
Well, to come full circle again, you alluding to the PRs and that's public relations for those who don't know. You reminded me immediately of Edward Bernays, and Edward Bernays having been involved with the United Fruit Company, that, you know, with the
critical,
right, and running, you know, his descendants running today's Netflix and all that jazz. So that, again, to come full circle, because you alluded to Guatemala and the United Fruit Company just to take back the resources, and how did Edward Bernays help that? Because people read, I've heard a lot of people read Edward Bernays and they're like, look, he's helping us understand propaganda. It's like, bro, he's teaching the other people to use propaganda against us, and he was also CIA affiliated. So it's like, people really need to understand these things. So we don't.
Small world.
It is a small world. It has been a phenomenal conversation, you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. It was wonderful to get you guys pinging off of one another. I was like, this was really like a very, I'm not much of a girl power kind of girl, but this is girl power.
Yeah, no, I'm so happy, and yeah, this is the first time I've been on the same platform with Colonel Towner Watkins, and it's been such a pleasure, really.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, Cynthia. Thank you for doing this.
Wait, this is the first time you guys were on a platform together?
Yes.
I didn't know that. We didn't know that.
But via email quickly, but yeah, it's the first time we've had that opportunity.
Oh my God.
Nice.
Yay.
Let's go for us. No, just kidding.
Okay, well, I want everybody to find your work and continue the research that we've been alluding to this whole conversation, because there was a lot said and there was a lot not said. So we will start with Cynthia, because it's very easy. She is, speaking of communism and being centralized, there's one place you can find her.
Wow.
Directed. This is her Substack, Through a Glass Darkly. And if there's specific things, because I know sometimes Cynthia alluded to the fact that there's so much out there, there's a lot of signal to noise ratio and information overload. You pick an interest. I know she's written on it, so you can actually search if you guys want.
Yeah, use
put
a
in some
keyword
keywords of like
what
cases.
you're interested in, and it'll come up of different articles.
Yeah,
that
she
she's
alluded to
written
the
on 'em.
Gouzenko hoax. If you want to look at that, if you want her book, you can put in the title. So definitely do that. This is where you can follow up on her work. Colonel Towner is also on Substack. She has Colonel Towner's newsletter. So people can do
And you can still do the same.
yeah,
search
same
engine
thing, search thing. If keywords, key operations. If anyone here is also wondering about, you know, maybe being psyoped, giving charities to like the World Wildlife Fund, you can also learn more about that from her. So between these two, there's a wealth of knowledge that you can drown in. So definitely abuse that search function.
Learning about that messed up my brain.
Me too.
The World Wildlife Fund?
Yeah.
Because we had friends that were like, oh, sir, they are lesser people that don't know how to govern themselves. And then I listened to that segment that you did, and I was like, are you fucking kidding me?
That's the biggest conservative psyop that I hear uttered in Alberta all the time, is the fact that foreign countries, the less developed countries, they're less developed because of their values are lesser, and we being superior, built on Christian values, that's the reason we've gotten here. And I'm like, it's as simple as saying Canada's communist, which is why you shouldn't do it. So other than Colonel Towner's Substack, she is on X, where she is frequently
Yelling at people.
yeah, yelling at people, precisely. So if you're a scroll intelligent people, she's one of them. And I also pulled up earlier if people weren't
if you
watching.
go to playlists, that's where you can scroll down and listen to her do like book readings and go over them. Cynthia's is literally like the first one at the bottom.
Yeah, but so definitely check out her Rumble, because again, more information that you guys can drown in. If there's nothing else left to be said, there was a lot of books that got alluded to. I will have them in the description, in the notes, and I'm glad this was the first. We got to capitalize on the two of you ladies getting together, and hopefully we can do it again in the future, because I know we have barely touched one drop in the bucket.
Buy Cynthia's book. It'll change your life.
Oh.
Oh.
We didn't tell her to say that.
Clip out. I'm going to share that with everybody now.
Thank you, ladies, so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a real pleasure again.
Yay. Well, without further ado, everybody, this has been another episode of At Home with Holmes.